Hello students, so in this video I want to give you a brief overview of the German oral examination. As you probably know already, the German oral exam is worth 25% of your examination at leaving certificate. The other percentage is made up, of course, of the reading and the oral and then the writing and grammar sections. Now, the German oral exam, it doesn't seem like a lot, but actually the German oral exam is fundamental to doing well in your leaving certificate exam, because a lot of the material that you prepare for your oral exam, it provides a brilliant foundation for later use, let's say, in the written part of the exam. I remember when I did my oral exam, I had a small A5 copy, just the standard schoolbook copy, and in it I had all of my topics and all of my answers done out, and this really gave me a lot of confidence going into the oral exam. And I remember that copy was very, very well used, and I went over it again and again. And that's what I'd recommend to you. Really, at this stage, you should be finalising that set of notes that you're going to use in the oral exam, and just go over it again and again and again until you know it really, really well. So what I propose today is to just go through the notes that I give to students and the notes that I use, and of course you'll have to edit them and adopt them for yourself, but they will provide you hopefully with a good foundation to use in your German oral exam. So you can see here in this little diagram that reading is, as I've said already, that's the breakdown. I won't go through that again. How the German oral exam is marked, you might find this little pie chart useful. So it says here general conversation is 40%, picture stories are 30%, and then role plays are 30%. So the general conversation is what I'm focusing on in this class. And when it comes to general conversation, I always tell students that it's quite predictable. Nothing is 100% predictable, but it's quite predictable, and I really divide it up into 8 topics, and those 8 topics I would say are Ich und meine Familie, that's the first one. Then 2, der Wohnort, so where you live, where you're from. 3, die Schule, talking all about your school. 4, and related to die Schule, I would put as Deutsch, German, so what do you do in German class, and so on. Number 5, I would put your hobbies, so hobbies and Freizeit, be able to talk about your own hobbies. Number 6, if you have a Nebenjob, a part-time job, Teilzeitarbeit, be able to talk about what you do in the part-time job and so on. Number 7, Deutschland oder im Ausland, so were you ever abroad? This is a section, this is an area where it's very common to be asked a question in the past tense. And finally, Pläne für die Zukunft, or just the general topic of die Zukunft, what would you like to do in the future? So these 8 topics, I would say, summarize really most of the preparation that you'll need to do for your oral exam. And if you prepare an answer for each of these 8 topics, you will do very, very well in the Leaving Cert oral exam. So what I'm going to do here, first of all, is just run through the basics for students that perhaps wants to be reminded, and everybody at times needs to be reminded of the basics in this. And I'm going to just read through this simply and fill in the blanks. This is really just a sheet with blanks on it, and we'll get to some more notes in just a moment. So, wie heißen Sie is a very common question, and then you would put here Ich heiße, and then your first name, your second name. You can say Eva ist mein Vorname und mein Nachname ist Murphy. You could say that. Second question, wie alt sind Sie? So ich bin, so most students will be 18 Jahre alt. Be able to say your birthday. So for example, ich habe am 1. Juni Geburtstag. And there are a couple of those there. Be careful with the longer ones like 21. or with a month like April. You want to pronounce it properly. Thirdly, then, you could just go straight into the self-description. So, beschreiben Sie sich. Here are some nice adjectives you can use. Freundlich, friendly. Faul is lazy. Fleißig is hardworking. Locker is easygoing. Gut aussehend, good-looking. Schön und intelligent. Ehrlich is honest. Gut gelaunt is good-humoured. Höflich, polite. Vergesslich, forgetful. Schüchtern is shy. Musikalisch, musical. Sportlich is athletic, and lustig is funny. Now, what I like to hear students do is to say I am rather. So, like ich bin eher locker, sehr fleißig und ziemlich sportlich. Just those little what I call quantifiers that you see there. Those eher, sehr und ziemlich. They're just nice to hear students using those. You can give your height, so getting just to some your physical attributes. Ich bin 1 Meter, vielleicht 80 groß. So this just be your height. For example, I am 1 meter and 80 if you think that's quite tall. Und you could say schlank, slim. Be able to say ich habe blaue Augen, and be able to describe your hair. For example, lange glatte for straight, und the color schwarze Haare. Und ich habe Sommersprossen if you have freckles, or you could say ich trage eine Brille if you wear glasses. Now be also able to do that for a sibling. We're going to come to siblings now, but if you have a sibling, be able to describe a sibling also. So then, wo sind Sie in der Familie? Where are you in the family? So be able to say ich bin. Now if you're a guy and you're the oldest, it'll be ich bin der Älteste. So that'll be ich bin der Älteste. If you're a girl, you obviously say die. If you're the second youngest, zweitjüngste. The youngest, jüngste. If you're in the middle, just say ich bin in der Mitte, and so on. Zweitälteste, second eldest. Now then, if you have brothers and sisters, ich habe Geschwister. Now, sometimes students get a bit scrambled on that point, telling their siblings' names. So I generally say, if you're asked, do you have siblings, just say, ja, ich habe. And if it's then, let's say, one sister, eine Schwester, und three brothers, drei Brüder, then just say sie heißen, they are called. Don't get caught in the trap of trying to say his name is and her name is. Just say they are called, sie heißen, and then you can list off the names. A common question is, wie kommen Sie mit Ihren Geschwistern aus? And just be careful here, a lot of students leave out that little prefix at the end. So you want to say, I get on well with my siblings. Ich komme gut. Now here you could just pick one particular sibling. So ich komme gut mit meiner älteren Schwester Mary aus. And never pass up on an opportunity in German to use nice little phrases. So this little phrase here says, Sie hat immer ein offenes Ohr, which means she always has a listening ear. She's always ready to listen to me. If she doesn't live at home, you could say, Sie wohnt in Cork und sie arbeitet bei Aldi. Now, if you're talking about siblings, let's say you're the oldest and you're talking about siblings that are still in school, it's nice to say what year they're in, especially if they're in the school that you're taking your Lebensweg German oral examen. So, for example, ich habe zwei jüngere Schwestern. Sie heißen Bridge und Moira. Then you could say, for example, Bridge besucht diese Schule und ist im Übergangsjahr, which is TY. Und we said Moira, didn't we? So Moira ist im zweiten Jahrgang. And that's the German way of saying she's in second year. You cannot just say Jahr in German. You have to use this phrase. It's better to use this little phrase, im zweiten Jahrgang. If she's in third year, im dritten Jahrgang, im vierten Jahrgang, im fünften Jahrgang, and so on and so forth. Now you could say then, ich bin der Älteste, ich komme gut mit meinen Geschwistern aus. Meistens verstehen wir uns gut, aber manchmal streiten wir uns. Wir streiten uns über Musik, Lärm, which means noise, und über Spülen und Abtrocknen. Ich bin fuchsteufelswild, wenn meine Geschwister nicht im Haushalt helfen. Again, a little phrase. Now, a common question again, how is it to be where you are in the family? So, wie ist es in der Mitte zu sein, oder wie ist es der oder die Älteste zu sein? Here's a typical answer to that question. Es ist in Ordnung, it's okay. Meine Eltern behandeln mich, which means they treat me normalerweise als ich erwachsen wäre. That's a beautiful use of the conditional tense, as if I was, or as if I would be an adult. Ich bin streng erzogen worden. Ich habe ein positives Verhältnis zu meinen Eltern. So this means you're raised well and you have a good relationship with your parents. Meine Eltern sind immer für mich da. A lovely phrase again. Wir lösen Probleme immer gemeinsam. So we solve problems together. And then the next question, the next answer there just touches on if you're in the middle, how you could say, ich habe mehr Freiheit als meine jüngeren Geschwister. Und auch habe ich nicht so viel Verantwortung, which means responsibility, als meine älteren Geschwister. So that really ties up a very decent answer on meine Familie. This brings us then to the topic of mein Wohnort. Now, just to warn you at the outset, there are a lot of different words that an examiner can use for where you live. So, wo wohnen Sie, they might say beschreiben Sie den Wohnort, describe the area, the place you live. There are other words like die Gegend or die Umgebung, the surroundings. Das Gebiet, the area. So just be conscious of that when you're asked about where you're from. So just to start us off here, that's a little mistake there actually. The question will always be wo wohnen Sie? Where do you live? and oftentimes students get that question word mixed up with who, but it means where. Wo wohnen Sie? So ik wohne auf dem Land. So let's just say you live in a small village near to a bigger town, because this is often something that confuses students. So this, you'd be better off, just oftentimes it's better off just to be as honest as possible and to try and build a realistic answer to the question. So you could say then, ik wohne auf dem Land, I live in the countryside, der Ort heißt, and just give the name of the village there. Then you could say, ik wohne vielleicht 10 Kilometer von der Stadt, so I live 10 kilometers from a bigger town. So let's say the town is Outland. Ik wohne 10 Kilometer von der Stadt Outland. Es ist sehr günstig, it's very convenient. What type of house do you live in? You could just throw that in. Ik wohne in einem Einfamilienhaus. I live in a detached house. There are other types of house there. If you live in an estate, ik wohne in einer Wohnsiedlung. Of course, you might live in einem Einfamilienhaus in einer Wohnsiedlung. Now, a very common question to get then is, wohnen Sie gern here? Do you like living here? So be prepared for that. Ik wohne sehr gern here. Always better to be positive where you can. You could say then, in Athlone ist viel los. So in Athlone, there's always a lot happening. Ist immer viel los. Now, if you want to say the opposite, I've got that in here, so you can just use the opposite part of that. Es gibt viel zu tun. There's always much to do. Es gibt viel zu tun. If you want to say there's nothing to do, es gibt nichts zu tun. A lovely little phrase to use is to say the school is just nearby. And a lovely phrase for that in German is, die Schule ist nur einen Katzensprung entfernt, which means it's a stone's throw away, or literally it's a cat's jump away. Die Schule ist nur einen Katzensprung entfernt. Now, of course, you can use other things here. It doesn't have to be die Schule. You could say der Fußballplatz ist nur einen Katzensprung entfernt, or something else, some other place that you go a lot. Now, it's critical that you're able to give a paragraph or more describing where you live. So do not be unprepared for that. It doesn't bode well for you if you haven't prepared at least a paragraph describing your town. And it can be really simple. For example, something like Athlone hat ungefähr 20,000 Einwohner. So I'm not sure how many people live in Athlone, but I'm just picking Athlone as random, but you could pick a different town. So Athlone, the town nearest to you, obviously. Athlone hat ungefähr, let's say, 20,000 Einwohner. Now, let's say you go to a different town shopping. You could say, ich gehe in Mullingar einkaufen, weil es größer ist. So perhaps you live between two towns and you want to say, I go to this town shopping, weil es größer als Athlone ist. But stick with one town, the town that you normally, or that you live closest to. Be able to list off a line of different features that are in your town. So for example, es gibt eine Bibliothek, there's a library, viele schöne Restaurants, 5 Supermärkte. And I always try and pronounce the A umlaut a bit like an A sound. Es gibt 5 Supermärkte, or 5 Fußballplätze rather than Platz. Ein Einkaufszentrum, a shopping centre, and again with the Z sound. Try and give that kind of a pizza sound. Einkaufszentrum. Examiners will pick up if you're making an effort with the pronunciation. Makes a huge difference. 3 Schulen, 3 schools. You could say eine Grundschule or the 3 Grundschulen. Einen Rugbyplatz, and then a rugby pitch. You could also comment, especially if you live auf dem Land, you could comment on the countryside, the scenery. What is die Landschaft like? Wie ist die Landschaft? Die Landschaft ist wunderschön. Es gibt Felder, which is fields, Seen, which is lakes, Berge, mountains, alte Gebäude, old buildings, ein Schloss, a castle, Wanderwege, hiking paths, so a bit like the Greenway, and Moore, if there's bogs around about. So here is a more comprehensive answer to that question, all put together, which I won't really read, but perhaps you can read it there on the screen. Again, if you want to give a slightly more comprehensive answer as to why you like the place, I've put that in here under Ihrer Meinung nach. So they might ask you, ist Mullingar eine schöne Stadt, Ihrer Meinung nach? Is it a nice place in your opinion? Ehrlich gesagt wohne ich nicht so gern here, which means honestly I don't really like living here. Es ist totlangweilig, it's very boring, denn es gibt nichts für Jugendliche zu tun. Die Arbeitsmöglichkeiten sind auch sehr schlecht. Es gibt fast keine jungen Leute, denn die meisten fahren nach Dublin, um eine Arbeitsstelle zu finden. Just a little phrase there, a little noun, die Arbeitsmöglichkeiten. That is a really useful phrase. It's just really the work possibilities, the work options. And you can also say die Einkaufsmöglichkeiten or die Freizeitmöglichkeiten. Möglichkeiten as well. Now, a nicer answer, a more positive answer, which I always encourage students to be positive, is to say, of course, I love living here. Natürlich wohne ich gern in Mullingar und möchte dort immer wohnen. So I'd like to live here always. Meine Familie und Freunde wohnen hier. Man ist nicht weit von allen Einkaufsmöglichkeiten und Freizeitmöglichkeiten. Es gefällt mir dort, weil immer was los ist. That's a nice phrase, meaning there's always something going on. Die Arbeitsmöglichkeiten sind auch ziemlich gut und es ist einfach, einen Nebenjob zu finden. And if you wanted to talk about your part-time job and you throw in a sentence like that, it can always act as a bridge to talking about another topic like your Nebenjob. You could talk a little bit about the agriculture here. Landwirtschaft ist sehr wichtig. Viele Leute arbeiten auf dem Land. Andererseits, on the other hand, arbeiten viele Leute in Büros und kleinen Geschäften und andere arbeiten auch in Fabriken, which are factories. In letzter Zeit, a lovely phrase which means recently, haben viel mehr Startups und Kleinbetriebe in der Gegend geöffnet. Now, just in terms of the icing on the cake when it comes to where you live, if you're running out of something to say, it is lovely to talk a little bit about tourists and what there is in the area for tourists. And this is just a little paragraph that you can use to do that. You'd have to adopt it for where you are. But here's something you could say. Der Tourismus, der Ort ist bei Touristen sehr populär, besonders. So oftentimes when you have a main town, like let's say Castlebar in County Mayo, you might have another town like Westport a bit further away, which is more renowned for tourists, or tourists are more likely to go to. And there are many other examples around Ireland you can give of this, where there's a town that's maybe more commercial, and then there's a town that's more touristy beside it, which is smaller, but tourists tend to go there more. So this would be a good example to talk about that. So you could say der Ort ist bei Touristen sehr populär, besonders. So let's say you live in the Midlands, you could say Athlone is more popular with tourists, maybe. Eine Stadt ungefähr 45 Minuten weit entfernt. That shows a bit of a niche when you're apart. You're talking about another town that's 45 minutes away. Dort gibt es ein altes Schloss. There's an old castle there und auch eine Kunstgalerie. Auch gibt es ein schönes Museum, wo man viele interessante Dinge sehen kann. This means where one can see, or you can see, lots of interesting things. Es gibt viele Informationen erhältlich. That's a little bit difficult to pronounce that word, Informationen. There's lots of information available über irische Geschichte und es ist sehr interessant. Der Fluss Shannon fließt durch die Stadt und viele Touristen kommen dort im Sommer, um angeln zu gehen. Sie kommen aus Großbritannien, Amerika, Deutschland und Frankreich. Es gibt viele Hotels und Frühstückpensionen. Wir haben auch in Mullingar gute Restaurants, viele Wanderwege und so weiter. So if there is a particular hiking or a greenway near you, you could also mention that. So that is a very comprehensive answer on der Wohnort, and one that, if well prepared, will really help you to hit the bar high. This brings us then to die Schule, which is really the third topic in the line of 8, and I will put die Schule und Deutsch together as topics 3 and 4. Now, with die Schule, you need to be able to talk about your own school, and as we know, in Ireland, schools are very different. You have gemischte Schule, you have schools that are Mädchenschule und Jungenschule, you have schools auf dem Land und in der Stadt, you have big schools and small schools. So be able to give a brief outline of your school, and then also be able to talk about der Schultag, like your school day, both of which I'm going to cover now. So let's just start by talking about the school. Now, I'll describe a school here, but your school might be a bit different. You might want to adopt this answer a little bit. So, unsere Schule ist ein Internat. Now, that's a boarding school. You can just say, unsere Schule ist ein Gymnasium. If your school is sort of the typical school in Ireland that prepares people for university, then you could just say ein Gymnasium. Ungefähr, die Hälfte, ungefähr means approximately, so these lines here just place for you to write in an English translation. Ungefähr, which means approx. Die Hälfte der Schüler wohnen im Internat und die anderen sind Tagesschüler. Probably not relevant to most schools. Es gibt etwa, this is nice, there is about 400 students und Schülerinnen und 35 Lehrer und Lehrerinnen. So be able to say in very quickly how many students attend the school. It's very nice for an examiner who comes to the school to say straight away, well, this is a big school, or it's a medium-sized school, or it's a small school. Wir haben eine Bibliothek, eine große Turnhalle. If it has a particular name, you can write it in there. Viele Laboren, that's laboratories. Ein Lehrerzimmer, that's a staff room. Einen neuen Hockeyplatz oder einen neuen Rugbyplatz oder einen neuen Fußballplatz if you have a new pitch. Und ein paar Rugbyplätze. Wir haben auch schöne grüne Schulgelände. This is a nice thing to say if you're in a school which is out the countryside and it's got nice surroundings. We have nice school grounds. If you have a new room in the school, maybe ein neues Zimmer für technische Fächer. We have a new room for technical subjects. Und eine Kantine mit leckerem Essen. So if you have a canteen in the school with delicious food, you can say that. Now, this is a nice thing to say, im Großen und Ganzen. This means all in all, or all things considered. Kommen die Schüler und Lehrer gut miteinander aus? Und es gibt eine angenehme Stimmung in der Schule. So this means on the whole, students and teachers get on well together and there is a pleasant atmosphere in the school. Lovely thing to say about a school. There's a pleasant mood or a pleasant atmosphere in der Schule. Coming then to the second part, and this is a really important place where you're asked to describe your school day. Now this is a little bit of a minefield because when we come to talk about our school day, particularly in German, there are lots of reflexive verbs and there are separable verbs at the start, and it's very easy to stumble on these if you haven't prepared for them well. So just be really careful that you don't leave out that prefix at the end. So when we jump into the first sentence, you'll see straight away what I mean. Normally I get up at 7 o'clock. Normalerweise, so I'll just highlight the important ones here. Stehe ich 7 Uhr auf. Make sure you've got that auf at the end. I get up at 7. Ich wasche mich, that's a reflexive verb. And then a reflexive and separable verb together. Dann ziehe ich mich an, which means I get dressed. Dann ziehe ich mich an. Ich esse kein Frühstück. Now, of course, you should eat breakfast, so you could say ich esse Frühstück, Toast mit Cornflakes oder Toast mit Butter und Käse or whatever it might be. If you don't eat breakfast, ich esse kein Frühstück, aber ich trinke einen Kaffee. I drink a coffee. Die Schule beginnt, so when does school begin? And now, if you're saying how you get to school, which isn't here actually, but ich komme jeden Tag mit dem Bus zur Schule. I'd be really careful with that. Examiners will be looking to see, are you following time, manner, place? Do you say, ich komme mit dem Bus zur Schule? Always put the zur Schule at the end. Or ich komme zu Fuß zur Schule, if you walk to school. Oder ich komme mit dem Auto zur Schule. Just a small thing there. Die Schule beginnt 5 vor 9, if it begins at 5 to 9, oder es beginnt 9 Uhr, die Schule beginnt 9 Uhr. Aber es gibt eine Schulversammlung, if you have a school assembly or something like that, earlier you can mention that, 4 vor 9. Jede Unterrichtsstunde dauert 40 Minuten, normally they're 40 minutes or an hour, so dauert 60 Minuten oder dauert eine Stunde. You could say that. Then you could just very briefly, and don't get too hung up on this, but describe your school day. Wir haben 3 Stunden bis 5 vor 11 Uhr und dann eine kurze Pause, a short break. Nach der Pause haben wir noch 3 Stunden bis zur Mittagspause 10 nach 1. Die Schule ist 4 Uhr aus. That's a nice way of saying school is over at 4 o'clock. What do you do after school? Nach der Schule treibe ich Sport. This means I do sport. Nach der Schule treibe ich Sport. Ich bin Mitglied, I'm a member of an athletic club and I train every Wednesday evening. Man bleibt dadurch fit. One stays fit that way. Ich finde Sport einen guten Ausgleich, which means a good balance to school stress, zum Schulstress. Ich spiele sehr gern draußen Basketball. Meiner Meinung nach ist das fantastisch. Nach dem Abendessen verlese ich, which means I laze about. Früher, which means earlier, habe ich Fußball und Basketball gespielt, aber jetzt habe ich keine Zeit dafür. Now I don't have any time. Ich unterhalte mich, this is a nice way of saying I chat or I converse with my family. Und dann mache ich meine Hausaufgaben, natürlich. Dieses Jahr muss ich viel länger lernen, weil ich das Liebenzeit mache. Jetzt habe ich die Nase voll. A lovely little phrase which means I'm up to my eyes, I've had enough sort of thing. Now, haben Sie ein Lieblingsfach? Very common question here. Ich habe sogar 2. Geschichte finde ich sehr interessant und Religion gefällt mir auch. Ich mache den Leistungskurs, which means I'm doing higher level in both subjects. Be careful with subjects. Fach is one subject and Fächer is more than one subject. It's the plural. Just make sure you pronounce it well. If you have 2 subjects, meine Lieblingsfächer sind. If you have just one favorite subject, mein Lieblingsfach ist. Just be careful with that. Ich mag diese Fächer, denn ich interessiere mich für Philosophie. Ich lese sehr gerne die Bücher der Philosophen. Ich bekomme immer gute Noten in diesen Fächern. Lovely way of just a really good reason why I like the subject. I get good grades in the subject. And then subject you might have difficulties with. Mit Mathematik habe ich Schwierigkeiten manchmal und ich mache natürlich, which means of course I am doing ordinary level. Of course, den Grundkurs. So on the next page then we have a list of vocabulary here, die Vokabeln für die Schüler, and here is just a page with different sections on it that will help you build a little profile of your own school. Another thing I should say at this juncture is that it is very difficult to prepare a section for every possible question. In fact, it's impossible that you might be asked. And one clear example of this that I meant to mention is back when we were revising for Die Familie, one question you could be asked, for example, is Wie helfen Sie im Haushalt? So how do you help around the house? So have an answer on that about maybe a couple of chores that you do. But even if you do get a question like that, you can always lead it back into how your relationship with your brothers and sisters or something else that you have prepared, as long as it's relevant, of course. So two examples of places of that here, again, would be die Regeln, so es gibt viele Regeln. Here we have, for example, es gibt viele Regeln, and we also have a little section here on die Uniform, so be able to talk about your uniform, die Vorteile und die Nachteile von der Uniform, be able to mention that also. I've called this section Deutsch, and you'll see it's here as section 4 in the oral handbook. So the first question I've done here is just generally, wie finden Sie Deutsch? And I always say to students, be positive. Even if you find German difficult, the examiner is going to know that. They really will be appreciative if you say, ich finde Deutsch schwierig, aber die Sprache ist interessant, oder der Unterricht ist interessant, oder ich finde die Vokabeln einfach, if there's a particular part of it that you find easy. So I've written here, ich schwärme für Deutsch. That's a lovely phrase to use. Ich schwärme für Deutsch. Oder ich mag Deutsch if you're not quite as passionate. Aber ich finde manchmal die Grammatik ein bisschen schwierig. And the line here is just to fill in the translation. So ein bisschen means a little. I find the grammar a little difficult. The question then that is often asked is, was machen Sie konkret in Deutsch oder im Deutschunterricht? And this is, what do you do specifically in German class? And unless you're prepared to answer this question, you are probably going to get stuck. It's quite difficult to rhyme off a list of things you do in German class unless you've prepared for it. So here are some good examples. Wir üben Grammatik. We practice grammar. You could always throw in Übung macht den Meister, that little phrase. Wir lesen literarische Texte. We read literary texts und beantworten Fragen dazu. Wir lesen Texte über Deutschland, Österreich und die Schweiz. Wir reden über uns selbst und besprechen verschiedene Themen. Besprechen is to discuss, so we discuss different themes. Wir üben Rollenspiele und lesen Bildergeschichte vor. Wir diskutieren Themen wie die Probleme der Umwelt und Ausländer. So Ausländer are immigrants, zum Beispiel die Energiekrise. This would be one that's maybe a little bit more topical to today, the energy crisis, the manufactured energy crisis, you could say. Wir vergleichen is we compare Deutschland und Irland. We compare Germany and Ireland. And then ab und zu, which is a little phrase that means occasionally or now and again, zeigt uns der Lehrer deutsche Filme oder Fernsehsendungen. Again, a very common follow-up question. Was finden Sie schwer beim Sprachenlernen? Or was finden Sie schwierig beim Sprachenlernen? What do you find difficult with language learning? Am Anfang is at the start, or at the beginning, habe ich die Vokabeln schwierig gefunden. Die Grammatik auch ist ein Problem. Es ist zu schwer für mich. Die Zeitformen, that's the tenses, und die Fehler, which is the cases, sind ziemlich verzwickt. That's tricky. Ich weiß nie, ob ein Verb stark oder schwach ist. So stark und schwach are just different ways of saying regular or irregular verbs in German. Einige Wörter sind sehr lang, zum Beispiel Geschwindigkeitsbeschränkung, which is the German word for speed limit, and you might get a smile out of the examiner if you say that. By the way, all of these sort of extra phrases or extra top-up things you might be saying, it goes without saying that you will actually lose marks if you don't say them properly. Not lose marks, but it's most important to have the basics right, and these things are really the icing on the cake. There's no point putting icing on the cake if the cake itself is very badly made. So I should say that with all of these extra little phrases, make sure you have the basics right first. Passiv und Konjunktiv sind schwer auch. And that passive is the passive tense, and Konjunktiv is really the conditional tense. Was finden Sie leicht? Ich finde die Aussprache leicht. I find the pronunciation easy. Hörverständnis ist auch okay. So listening comprehension is also okay. Ich finde die Gespräche kinderleicht. I find the conversations easy peasy or very easy, child easy really there. Lohnt es sich is it worth it to study foreign languages? So is it worth it? Ja, sie sind wichtig für verschiedene Berufe wie Übersetzer, Dolmetscher und Reiseleiter. I won't write those in, but Übersetzer is a translator, Dolmetscher is an interpreter, somebody who's working more with a real live scenario. Und Reiseleiter is a tour guide. Natürlich sind sie auch wichtig für Firmen, die exportieren und importieren und für Banken und Hotels. Finally, Schule in Irland and Deutschland. This is a theme that might arise naturally if you said that you went on a Schüleraustausch, Student Exchange oder eine Reise nach Deutschland. Was sind die Unterschiede zwischen die Schüler oder die Gesellschaften in Irland und Deutschland? Die Ähnlichkeiten just means the similarities and Unterschiede are the differences. Here are 5 little differences and it'd be great if you could learn these. In Irland beginnt der Unterricht normalerweise 9 Uhr und in Deutschland beginnt die Schule schon 8 Uhr, das heißt viel früher, which means much earlier. Natürlich tragen die meisten Schüler in Irland eine Uniform, aber in Deutschland tragen die Schüler keine Uniform. Wir haben 9 oder 10 Stunden Unterricht am Tag. We have 9 or 10 classes a day. Now this isn't true anymore in some schools. In some schools in Ireland there are only 6, but many schools still have 9 or 10. Während deutsche Schüler nur 6 Stunden haben. Deutsche Schüler bekommen nur 6 Wochen Sommerferien, so they only get 6 weeks of holidays, und der Schultag ist hier viel länger als in Deutschland. So students, this video brings you to the second part of the German oral exam. As I said in a previous video, I really divide up the German oral exam, the general questions part, into 8 themes or topics: Familie, Wohnort, Schule, Deutsch being the first 4, and then hobbies, Nebenjob, Ausland oder im Ausland, und die Zukunft as being the last 4, and the ones that I'm going to discuss very briefly in this video now. Really, when it comes to these second group of 4 topics, a lot of what you're going to say will depend on you. And what I'll run through now with the help of this little handbook will be just some general points and phrases that you could use to apply to yourself. And really, when it comes to the German oral, have something to say. On all of these topics, have something to say. It's not enough in the German oral exam to be a boring person or to be somebody who's just saying, oh, I'm just studying now because I don't have enough time coming up to the Leaving Cert. You have to have something to say on your hobbies, on what you do in your leisure time, on whether you had a part-time job or you have one currently, on whether you were ever abroad in any country, and on your plans for the future. One thing I want to just touch on very briefly in this video, because I think it's really important, is if you're asked a question in the past tense, it's very important to answer in the past tense, and building confidence in that is something that we're going to look at in this video, and also building confidence in using the conditional tense or the future tense when it comes to that section on die Zukunft. So let's get into it by having a quick look first of all at hobbies and Freizeit, or Hobbys und Freizeit. And the question I have written here, and we're just going to run through this briefly, is Was tun Sie nach der Schule, sich zu entspannen? So what do you do after school to relax? I'll just read some of this briefly, what I have written here. I'll use red just so you can see what I'm writing. So ich interessiere mich für Sport und Musik, and try and pronounce those as Sport und Musik rather than the English way. Abends, which means every evening, spiele ich Musik auf meinem Handy oder ich downloade Lieder und setze meinen Kopfhörer auf. Hier in der Schule bin ich Mitglied des Schulchors. So this paragraph is really for somebody who is interested in music. Wir trainieren mittwochs während der Mittagspause. So the choir is during the midday break. Meiner Meinung nach, in my opinion, a lovely phrase, schafft Musik eine tolle Stimmung. It creates a lovely atmosphere, und ich kann vom Alltag abschalten. And that's just a lovely phrase that an examiner would love to hear. I can switch off from the everyday. Das gefällt mir. Again, a lovely phrase. I like that. Ich spiele seit 9 Jahren Gitarre und spiele sowohl klassische Musik als auch Gospelmusik. So here, again, just a couple of things. Students will often say, ich spiele für 9 Jahren Gitarre, and that's not correct German. You have to say, when you're speaking about something you did in the past, up until now, you have to use the German word seit, since, or for 9 years. And again, lovely use there of sowohl als auch, which means both, and correlative conjunctions. Really nice to see. Now, in terms of sport, here's a paragraph on sport. Unsere Schule hat einen tollen Ruf für Sport, besonders Hockey und Rugby. Your school might be Fußball. Fußball gefällt mir, aber leider, unfortunately, ist diese Sportart hier nicht so populär. Unfortunately, it's not so popular here. You can read through this yourself. I say, jedoch bin ich Mitglied des Basketballvereins, the member of the basketball club, und wir trainieren zweimal in der Woche. We train twice a week. Ich bin die Mannschaftskapitänin. Now that's if you're a girl. If you're a guy, we'll drop the I in at the end and just say der Mannschaftskapitän. Im dritten Jahrgang, which means in third year, and you have to say Jahrgang, haben wir die Leinster Meisterschaft gewonnen. So we won the championship. Das hat riesigen Spaß gemacht. Again, lovely use of the past tense and the phrase. Hier im Internat gibt es ein tolles Fitnessstudio, das alle Internatsschüler benutzen dürfen. Ich verbringe viel Zeit dort, man muss fit bleiben. Now this sentence would have relevance to a boarding school, but if you don't have a boarding school, you could just say hier in der Schule if you have some kind of fitness center, which understandably isn't in most schools, but you could say that there's one in a studio near you, perhaps. But then just when it comes to social media, there's a little paragraph there which you can read yourself. It might be no harm to be able to say something about that. That'll be on screen for you to read yourself. Now you might have other hobbies, and I've thrown a couple more in here just in terms of tennis and art. So what I would say with yourself is have one or have two hobbies preferably, and be able to talk about maybe the advantages and the disadvantages of sport or music, or why you like the hobby that you've chosen. So looking at tennis, ich schwärme für Tennis und bin Mitglied in meinem Tennisverein hier in meiner Heimatstadt in der Grafschaft Liège. Meine Freunde und ich spielen oft in Tenniswettbewerben mit. So this means I'm a member of my tennis club in my hometown in the county of Laois. My friends and I often play tennis Wettbewerben, lovely word, competitions. So we often play in tennis competitions. Beim Tennisspielen verbessert man viele praktische Fähigkeiten. So we improve many practical skills, especially hand and eye coordination. So here you can see a sentence like this. If the examiner doesn't ask you what are the advantages of tennis or the benefits of tennis, then you're already going into it without being asked. Maybe you're an artistic student. Ich bin künstlerisch begabt. I'm artistically gifted or talented. Und verbringe viel Zeit beim Malen und Zeichnen. And I spend a lot of time painting and drawing. Als Kind habe ich oft, was ich gesehen habe, gezeichnet. This is difficult enough to say. As a child, I often painted what I saw. Mein Vater hat mich viel ermutigt. My father encouraged me a lot. Das hat mir viel geholfen. That helps me a lot. Ich male besonders gern Portraits und habe viele von meinen Klassenkameraden gemalt. I especially like painting portraits, and I painted many portraits of my classmates. Ich finde solchen Gemälden sehr anspruchsvoll. I find such paintings very challenging. Now, here an example of this paragraph would be very much a higher end paragraph because there's a lot of past tense in it. I'm going to come and talk about the past tense in just a moment. There is the option, I might add just at this point, there is the option in your German oral exam of speaking about a German text or film or a literary piece of some sort that you have discussed and talked about in class. And this is a good option to take up on if you've prepared for it. Examiners are obliged to ask the question. You don't have to do it, but it is a good opportunity to say something that you've prepared in the German oral exam. The example I have here on the screen is about the story of the musicians of Bremen, which were 4 animals that were made redundant, and their owners didn't want them anymore, and they travelled, and there's a story about the thieves and so on that they saw, and the robbery that they intercepted, or the thieves that they intercepted on a farmhouse. It's an interesting story, and here is something typical that you could say in a situation like that. Again, as with any of these things, be very careful if you prepare something, be it on this story or a different story. Just make sure that it's not too long, I would say, and that it's extremely clear what you're saying. Sometimes students try to say something that's too complicated and it doesn't come out well, and it ends up being a weight on their performance rather than a benefit. So moving on then to the Teilzeitarbeit or Nebenjob. Here I have given you an example of something you could say. You could say at the top, if you don't want to talk about a part-time job, that's understandable. Im Moment habe ich keinen Job, weil ich für das Abitur lernen muss, aber normalerweise arbeite ich am Wochenende in einem Supermarkt. Ich bekomme manchmal Geld von meinen Eltern, wenn ich etwas brauche. So at the moment I have no job because I must learn or study for the Leavenscert, but normally I work at the weekend in a supermarket. I sometimes get money from my parents if I need anything. Then I've done, you could say that, and you could say I'm not working at the moment. Then I've given you some examples of what you could say if you do have a job in a supermarket or in a restaurant. Be able to say just briefly what you do. A couple examples here. You can see, ik moest die regalen nachvullen, I must stock the shelves. Ik poetste die regalen, ik help aan de kassa, I help on the till. And then a couple examples for the restaurant. Ik serveer die kunden, ik poetste die tische und ik koche das Essen. Be able to say also what you're doing with the money. So here, for example, ich spare mein Geld für nächstes Jahr, weil ich an der Uni gehen will. Ich kaufe Kleidung, Zeitschriften, Süßigkeiten, CDs und DVDs. So magazines and sweets. And again, this little sentence here, if you are going to talk about a part-time job, this little sentence here is actually really, really nice. It just summarizes, it's actually two sentences that summarize the benefits of having a part-time job. Meiner Meinung nach ist das eine gute Idee, Erfahrung, das Experience in der Arbeitswelt zu sammeln. Man lernt viele neue Fertigkeiten, so one learns many new skills. Gruppenarbeit und Kommunikationsfähigkeiten. Kommunikationsfähigkeiten are communication skills. And Erfahrung in der Arbeitswelt is experience in the world of work and collecting experience in the world of work. Now, if I are given an example of a part-time job that you're in, and the example I've chosen here is one of a supermarket, you can read that yourself. That's just an example of what you could say you do on a typical day, when you start on a Saturday and what you do Saturday and Friday. So that's an example of a part-time job. Part-time job is a quite a minor topic. It's not something that's going to take very, very long. We come then to section 7, and Teil 7 is what I call Outland. Now these are all sections I've made myself. They're not necessarily, they have no weighting other than that. With this topic, it's really, really important that you're confident in speaking in the past tense. When it comes to the past tense, you might see something appearing on the screen now, just about the two different types of past tenses. Of course, there's the imperfect tense, and the two verbs that you use the imperfect tense with are sein, which becomes waren in the past tense, and haben, which becomes hatten in the past tense. So for example, you might say, ich war in Deutschland. That's perfectly fine. Germans would say that in everyday conversation. And you could also say, I had a lot of spending money, so ich hatte viel Geld mit. So I had a lot of money with me. Aside though from those two examples, haben and sein, you have to speak in the past perfect. And this is where the problems start for a lot of students, because they will say, for example, they'll start to make mistakes. We know that verbs of motion always take sein. So this means if you're saying, I traveled to Germany, ich bin nach Deutschland gefahren, you have to say, ich bin gefahren, because you're moving to Germany, you're traveling to Germany. Or ich bin nach Köln geflogen, I flew to Cologne. When it comes to other things you did there then, for example, that you saw a museum, ich habe das Mercedes Museum gesehen, I saw the museum, then you'd say ich habe das Museum gesehen. So just be very careful on that. And really it does come down to practice. You might think you have it, you might think logically that you've mastered that it's sein for verbs of motion and it's haben for ordinary verbs, but really it's one of those things, you're in the moment, you're nervous, you're under pressure, and students will gravitate to the easiest option or to the mistake maybe, and it's unfortunate when that happens because an examiner's ear is trained and they can pick that up really easily. So what I have here for you is an example. You could say you went to München if you did go to München, or you could maybe change it for a German city that you did visit. It doesn't have to be about Germany, by the way. It can be about Frankreich, France, Griechenland. It can be about any country. But if you're obviously not in the country during the German oral, so it's likely to be in the past tense that you'll be discussing this. And therefore it's a great opportunity to master the past tense. So let's jump into it here and read this. Ich war schon einmal im Ausland. I was abroad. Ich war in Deutschland, in München. So abroad, im Ausland is abroad. Meine Familie hat da Urlaub gemacht. So this is the German word for holiday, like one holiday. So die Schulferien, aber Urlaub, when you're talking about a holiday you did. Ich war 3 Wochen da. So here we see straight away that you have the imperfect for here, but when you come to meine Familie hat da Urlaub gemacht, you're using the past perfect. So let's read on. München is die Hauptstadt, that's the capital or the main city in Bayern. Es hat mir gut gefallen. Lovely phrase meaning I enjoyed it. Es ist eine sehr schöne Stadt. Ich habe das Olympiastadion gesehen. Es gibt viele Museen und Galerien und Theaters. Das Wetter war hervorragend. Es hat gar nicht geregnet. So hervorragend just means it was brilliant, it was fabulous, fantastic. It didn't rain at all. So what did you do there? Well, es gibt da viel zu kaufen. Ich habe Souvenirs für meine Freunde gekauft. Ich habe ganz viel Schokolade mitgebracht. So I brought home, I guess, a lot of chocolate. Alles in allem, nice little phrase meaning all in all. Waren die Leute sehr nett, aber vielleicht ziemlich leise. So leise is just soft spoken. Es hat unheimlich viel Spaß gemacht. And throwing in these little phrases like it was an awful lot of fun, alles in allem, they just colour the writing as hat mir gut gefallen, and they just make it more palatable to the examiner's ear. If you're asked what are the differences or what you noticed was different there, you could just throw in this: alles war so anders da, everything was so different there. Die Landschaft ist ganz schön. Deutschland hat viele große Wälder und Flüsse, which means forests and rivers. Das Essen hat gut geschmeckt. The food tasted nice. Es war anders, aber lecker. Das Brot war ganz anders als bei uns und es hat viele verschiedene Sorten gegeben. So we say in the present tense es gibt. In the past tense you can say es gab oder es hat gegeben. There were many different types of bread. Ich habe viele ausprobiert. I tried many. For example, Vollkornbrot und Brezeln. This is whole grain bread and pretzels. Die Leute essen auch viel Fleisch, besonders Schweineschnitzeln. Nach der alten Saga, andere Länder, andere Sitten. Lovely little phrase to throw in, like the old saying, other countries, other customs. And then if you're asked, is it a good idea? Es ist eine ganz gute Idee, andere Länder zu besuchen, besonders wenn man die Sprache lernen will, especially if one wants to learn the language. You could be asked then very briefly, and I've covered this in a previous section on school, the differences between school in Germany and in Ireland. You could be also asked just differences in der Gesellschaft in general, society in general. Ich glaube, you could say der Lebensstandard ist in Deutschland höher, die Straßen sind dort besser, aber es gibt viel mehr Verkehr, there's a lot more traffic. So living standard is higher, the roads are better, it's a lot more traffic. Die Familie ist im Durchschnitt, which means on average, kleiner als in Irland. Die Deutschen stehen früher auf und gehen früher ins Bett als die Iren. The Germans go to bed earlier and get up earlier than the Irish. A little section here then on do you like travelling? So ich würde gern ins Ausland fahren. And this really brings me to the topic of the conditional tense. The conditional tense is a bit like the mo cnílach in Irish, and it's used to describe a situation that may happen. It's not a situation that will happen, so it's conditional. And really think of the word if always. If you had the option, would you do this? What would you do? And the simple way to say that in German is ich würde gern, and then plus the infinitive. So here's a clear example. Ich würde gern ins Ausland fahren. So I would like to travel abroad. Again, this is a verb you'd use. Ich möchte, again, part of the conditional tense. Ich möchte nach Russland, Deutschland und Kanada reisen. Ich möchte auch in die Vereinigten Staaten fahren. So this is the conditional tense. Ich interessiere mich für die Leute in das Land. Es ist immer interessant, in anderen Ländern die Kultur zu erleben. This means it's always interesting to look at the culture in other countries or to experience the culture in other countries. Und die Sitten und Gebräuche is really just like the customs and traditions, to get to know the customs and traditions. This brings us on finally to the last section, which is die Zukunft. And as I was just saying, the conditional tense is important when it comes to die Zukunft. It's actually probably more important than the future tense. So to be able to say, there are three examples here, and you'll probably see them coming up on the screen here now. There are three ways you can talk about what you would like to do in the future. One way is just to use the modal verb wollen or ich will, which is a false friend. It doesn't mean I will, it means I want to. So you could say, for example, ich will, I'm not sure what's on screen now, but you could say, for example, ich will Medizin studieren. I want to study medicine. Then you could use just ich will, I want to. You could also say ich werde, so I will travel to Dublin. Ich werde nach Dublin fahren. I will travel to Dublin. This is more emphatic. It's more certain that you will do it. The third way of talking about the future tense or the future is to use the conditional tense, which I just spoke about, and to say, for example, you would do something. I would help people in my career. Ich würde Leute helfen. or it would be lots of fun. Es würde viel Spaß machen. So you're using würde with the infinitive. So those are the three ways, and I would say keep those very clear in your mind. Those are the three ways to talk about the future. On this sheet, which I'm not going to read through, you just have various scenarios and various sentences you could use to talk about die Zukunft. And as it is with all students, whatever your particular circumstances are, you're going to have something different to say. But I would say take these three sentence formats: ich will, ich werde, so ich will, I want to; ich werde, I will; und ich würde gern, I would like to; or ich möchte, I would like to really build a little profile, just a paragraph or two about what you would like to do in the future and what your future plans are. Hope this video was helpful to you. You can see the content there on the screen, and remember to also prepare for the first 4 parts: Familie, Wohnort, Schule und Deutsch, and then these 4 parts we talked about today: Hobbys, Teilzeitarbeit oder Nebenjob, im Ausland und Pläne für die Zukunft. And give the oral your best shot. It really is good to do well in the oral and to be confident about it. I can still remember my own German oral and how it gave me a boost when I did well in it going into the other part of the exam, not to mention all of the content that I learned off in preparing for it. So give it your best shot, and you'll be glad you did, because you'll be well set up for the written German exam. Viel Erfolg. All the best. Hello everyone, in this video I want to give you some tips on how to approach the role plays and picture stories element of the German oral exam. Now before I do that, I want to just say a word about the order or the general structure of the oral exam. As you probably know already, I've covered the general conversation part of the exam in these 2 videos here, Oral 1 and Oral 2. And this video is about sections 2 and 3. Section 2 will be the picture stories, and section 3 is the role plays. Now, what is the order of the exam like? How will it be structured? Well, when you go in the door in 2022, you'll probably be asked firstly which 3 picture stories and role plays you've done. However, aside from that, the general questions that you'll get at the start of the exam will be: Wie heißen Sie? Wie ist Ihre Prüfungsnummer? And when you're answering this question, be clear and concise, have it well rehearsed. Meine Prüfungsnummer ist, and then read out the 6 digits. And be careful with 0, which is 0, and 1, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Make sure you pronounce those accurately and well. You'll also be asked, haben Sie Ihr Handy draußen gelassen? Which you can answer ja to. You should have left your phone outside. And also, sometime during the course of the exam, you'll be asked, möchten Sie über einen deutschen Text oder einen deutschen Film sprechen? And this is the question where you're asked if you'd like to talk about a German text or film that you've studied. And make sure you only answer this question and you only say ja if you have prepared a concise and accurate paragraph on that. Otherwise, you may lose marks. Now, as I've just said, the picture stories will be the second part of the exam and the role plays will be the third part. But in this video, I want to give you my tips on role plays first, because I believe that role plays are the easiest part of the German oral exam to prepare for and to do really well in. So my first tip with the role plays is really just learn them. In my view, they're the easiest 30 marks. It's 30 marks out of 400. They are possibly one of the easiest 30 marks that you can get in the Leaving Cert. It's no secret that if you memorize the C part, the part that you are expected to say in the role play, you can do really, really well. 27, 28 or 29 marks out of 30. So that is the first piece of advice I would give, is just go and learn your part for the role play and learn it well, and you'll be thankful you did. My second tip is to make sure you fulfill your tasks. 20 marks out of 30 in the role play will be for fulfilling tasks. Generally, there's 5 paragraphs, and in each paragraph there are 4 little tasks that you need to fulfill. It might be something like greet the policeman, describe the dog, and you might get 2 points or 2 tasks in the description. But make sure you fulfill those tasks. And what are those tasks? Well, generally, they're the bold parts of the candidate's card. So you might wonder, you'll be getting this candidate's card, you might wonder why some parts are in bold. And the reason is because those are the tasks. Make sure you fulfill those tasks and you fulfill them accurately. The third tip I would give is just to watch your pronunciation. Some words, if you mispronounce them, you will not get the mark, even the task mark. You will not get that mark for it. A good example would be the word Mitglied. Der Hund ist wie ein Familienmitglied. A lot of students would mispronounce that and pronounce it as Mitglied, which is incorrect. And what I always say to students is when E and I go walking, the second one does the talking. This is the tip I learned from another teacher along the way. And it's a great way to think about it, because in German, when you have a word like Eis, E-I-S, you pronounce it as an I sound, because in that E and I diphthong, the I comes second, so you pronounce it Eis. Whereas with a word like Mitglied, it's M-I-T-G-L-I-E-D, so you pronounce it Mitglied, which means member. Fourth tip I would give is listen to the examiner. It is a role play, it's a conversation, and sometimes the examiner might phrase something differently than you expected. So for example, when they say, they maybe give you advice in the conversation Hund verloren, they might say rufen Sie den Tierschutz an. And if you just say ja or nein, it's not really natural. It would be better, when they give a command like that, it would be better to say something like gute Idee, das mache ich. Or if they asked it as a question, then it would be differently and you could answer ja or nein. So just listen very carefully to the examiner. No matter what you may have learned or prepared or memorized, make sure that you're listening carefully to the examiner and that it's a natural conversation. Finally, with the role plays, my fifth tip would be expect a curveball. It can happen that the examiner will say something or look for more information and you really haven't expected this. In such cases, I would say be positive. Stay buoyant, stay upbeat, and most of all, stay accurate. Remember that at the end of the day, when it comes to the role play, you want to stay as accurate as possible, keep your German as good as possible, and that way you'll do your very best and get your very best mark. Now, when it comes to picture stories, I have 5 other tips, but before I get into those, I'd just like to mention firstly about the project. The project, if you're not doing your oral in 2022, you might be looking forward to 2023 or another year. I would advise you to consider strongly doing the project instead of the picture stories. That's what I did myself. My project, I think, was on Beethoven or maybe Bach. It was a musician, and it's really nice, the project, because the intersection between your learning of the German language and your own interests is much closer. It coalesces a lot more clearly with the project than it would with learning 5 picture stories. So the project is a brilliant idea, and you can prepare it over TY or 5th year and just have it there and ready to go, and it saves you doing all of this work around the further questions and the future projection on these 5 picture stories. However, when it comes to the picture stories, perhaps you're doing these this year and it's too late to change. Well, the picture stories are still a great idea, because the vocabulary that you prepare for the picture stories will help you going into the rest of the exam, because there are many different themes that are laced throughout the picture stories. My first tip with the picture stories is on your marks, and what I mean by that is know your marks. Know what the marks are going for. There are 10 marks for telling the story. There are 10 marks for explaining the pictures and giving a future projection. And then there are 10 marks for a question on a wider or a related theme. So make sure you know what those marks are for. Secondly, I would say get, set, go, or get to the point quickly when it comes to telling the story. It really is important to have a nice, cohesive, detailed account of the story ready that you're confident to tell, that you're waiting to tell, that's colourful and that's nice and that's accurate. And if there are huge long pauses, the examiner will move you on. So make sure that you know this part of the picture story well, that you've it well rehearsed. And one little tip I would give is, if you're finding it hard to learn off the whole story for pictures 1 to 6, maybe you know picture 1 and 2 well, I would say whenever you come to practice that picture story, especially in these final days, start on the 6th picture, and move backwards to the 5th picture, to the 4th picture. So do it backwards. So when you come to prepare it, then you're not gravitating towards the 1st picture, which you probably know very, very well. Instead, start with the 6th one and then go to the 5th one and then the 4th one and so on. And you should find the overall quality of that picture story narration really improving. Thirdly, I would say, and this is especially directed towards stronger students, accuracy is critical. And by accuracy, I mean adjective endings, I mean genders, I mean verb endings. If you don't have those parts really accurate in your narration of the picture story, you will drop from, let's say, and even if they're generally accurate, but they're not all 100% accurate, you can drop from a 10 marks to a 9, or from a 9 to an 8, or an 8 even to a 7. By genders, I mean, for example, saying der Stadt instead of die Stadt, or saying ist in die Stadt when it should be ist in der Stadt. Examiners will pick up on that, and if there are too many of those mistakes, the general result will be to bring your picture story down. So be accurate, and be accurate with your answers to questions and with your answers to future questions also. My fourth tip relates to the second part and especially to the second part of the picture story question, where you're asked to give an explanation of the pictures or even the future projection question, and even actually to the third part. And it's simply this, that make the most of questions where you're asked to describe a picture. This is a very common question, where you're asked, beschreiben Sie das Zimmer? Oder was kann man in dem Zimmer sehen? And the reason I say make the most of this is because they're actually really easy to prepare for. Es gibt einen Tisch, man kann einen Kühlschrank sehen, and so on. They're easy to prepare for, they're easy to give long answers for, to give list style answers, and to be confident when you're giving those answers. If you're asked one of these description questions, do your very best in it. And also I would say, when it comes to even follow-up questions, particularly on a picture story like the Chancen durch Deutsch picture story, you might even have the opportunity to hark back to some of the material you prepared for the general questions. For example, warum haben Sie Deutsch und nicht Französisch gewählt? You might be able to talk a little bit about language learning and how you found the German language easier to pick up perhaps than French. The two things you want to avoid are long pauses, and you also want to avoid improvisation that's not accurate and that will just lose you marks on the day. The fifth point I would say is just when it comes to the picture stories, make up your own questions and brainstorm. And by this I mean that when it comes to the picture stories, it's often very difficult to predict exactly what you'll be asked. In fact, it's impossible, because there are as many questions you can be asked as there are examiners. And the solution to this is to have generic strategies available. So, for example, to be able to describe pictures, to be able to talk about feelings, to be able to talk about what people are wearing, to be able to talk about how people look. These questions will never go wrong. And when you look at the picture stories, just yourself, you could say, well, what kind of questions do I think I might be asked on this picture story? And that's something that a parent or a brother or sister can also help you with, by just looking at the pictures and saying, well, exactly what could you be asked in this picture story? And that will help you to prepare, in a sense, for the unseen element of this exam. So those were my top 5 tips for the role plays and the top 5 tips for the picture stories. As it comes now to the exam, give it your very best shot. The amount of work you put in this final week really does make a huge difference on the day of the exam. You can take a break and schöne Osterferien after the exam, but from now until then, I wish you the very best. Viel Spaß, viel Erfolg.